So tonight we're going to go over Recreate Responsibly training. This is a training that we Creek Conservancy and Creek Park have put together to be able to train some of our volunteers in both our Recreate Responsibly stewardship messages, as well as just visitor communications as volunteers who are out in the park and often on the behalf of the Conservancy or the park. We just want to make sure that you are knowledgeable about all the ways to be good stewards, and also that you are equipped with the skills and language to be able to communicate about those stewardship principles with anybody that you come into contact with. Go ahead and share my screen.
And I'm so sorry, I realized I still had my microphone on. Ignore that.
Okay, can everyone see my screen okay? Great. So as I said, we'll start out, well, today's purpose is primarily to go over those Recreate Responsibly stewardship messages and talk about how to communicate about those messages. We'll start with just a quick overview of the National Park Service and Rock Creek Conservancy, and kind of how we work together to create and implement some of these volunteer opportunities that you all are a part of. And then at the very end, we'll also go over some de-escalation strategies, just in case the communication part gets trickier than you would hope when you're out in the field. So we'll go over a handful of things today.
So we're going to talk a little bit about the National Park Service mission. Of course, Rock Creek Park is a national park unit. And just, obviously not to be confused with the fact that there is a Rock Creek Regional Park run by Montgomery Parks. But the National Park Service mission, as you can see here, is to preserve unimpaired the natural and cultural resources and values of the national park system for the enjoyment, education, and inspiration of this and future generations. That's taking our legislation from 1916 and actually putting it into something that's easier to translate. So you can see that there's a dichotomy. How do you keep a place unimpaired when you have a lot of enjoyment of visitors? And that's part of what we're going to talk about today related to Recreate Responsibly, and how we can encourage people to do all of those things to help protect Rock Creek Park, which we love. In the second paragraph, you'll see that it talks a little bit about the National Park Service cooperating with partners. And we honestly couldn't do everything we do without the help of partners like the Rock Creek Conservancy. Next slide. So Rock Creek Park is the third oldest National Park Service site and the first urban national park. We were founded in 1890. Our legislation, which you'll take a brief look at in here momentarily, is very similar to Sequoia National Park and Yosemite National Park, which is really surprising because at the time, the National Park Service didn't exist until 1916. So eventually there were a collection of about 30 different national parks across the service before there was a National Park Service. And then we got the management unit called the National Park Service in 1916. So today, Rock Creek Park manages nearly 3,000 acres and 99 different pieces of land. A lot of places. Mm-hmm. I'll just hit a couple of the highlights, but you can see there's a lot within Rock Creek Park. Just in recreation, over 36 miles of unpaved trails, 31 picnic groves. We have 180 bird species, over 700 flowering plant species, 9 Civil War fort sites, 1 amphitheater, 2 boathouses, and much, much more. So the Rock Creek mission is based upon the 1890 legislation to be perpetually dedicated and set apart as a public park or pleasure ground for the benefit and the enjoyment of the people of the United States, to be known by the name of Rock Creek Park. So if you wondered why we're not called Rock Creek National Park or Rock Creek National Monument, it's because it's in our legislation that this is what we will be called. That doesn't mean that at any point in time that couldn't change if Congress designated it something else. Our superintendent is the person in charge of the park. Our superintendent is Julia Washburn, and she has 4 primary goals for us as staff. We focus on access for the public to the park, community engagement, stewardship, how can people give back, how can people contribute to the park, in those ways, and also employee engagement. So just to cover very broadly, we utilize volunteers in national parks all across the country. In fact, approximately 300,000 volunteers donated more than 6.5 million hours last year to the National Park Service. And of course, your time is worth money. And if we translated that, that means it's worth $185 million just in Rock Creek Park alone in our last budget year. When we say fiscal year, it's like October of one year to September of the next. That's what FY means. And we had over 2,600 volunteers, and they donated 22,630 hours. So again, we couldn't do what we do, not only without partners, but without our volunteers.
Thanks. And similarly, the Conservancy would not exist if it were not for the partnership with Rock Creek Park. So we are so thankful to be able to work with you all. But the Rock Creek Conservancy is the nonprofit partner not only to the national park within DC, but also to the entirety of the Rock Creek watershed. So oftentimes I think a lot of people do tend to think of the national park when talking about Rock Creek, which is this piece down here. But about 80% of the watershed is actually up in Montgomery County in Maryland. It starts in a golf course up here in Laytonsville, Maryland, and then is about 33 miles long down through Montgomery County through the districts, and it lets out at the confluence with the Potomac River near Georgetown. The Conservancy's mission is to restore Rock Creek and its parklands as a natural oasis for all people to appreciate and protect. And we do that through a variety of different community engagement and volunteer service opportunities, which we'll go through in a little bit more detail soon. But the full area of land or watershed area that we are helping to protect includes about 5,000 acres of parkland that crosses a lot of different types of jurisdictions. There's federal for the national park, regional, city, county, all sorts of different lines and partners that we work with to be able to help restore that area. And it includes about 500,000 or just over 500,000 residents. So it's a very diverse, very populated area. And we are very lucky to work with a pretty large extent of the Rock Creek community doing this work. And then again, this note at the bottom, we are the philanthropic and friends partner to Rock Creek Park. So we could not do a lot of the work that we do without this partnership. The Conservancy operates through a model of what we call people-powered restoration. So this is basically the idea that without the support of the Rock Creek community, we wouldn't be able to make the kind of impact that we do. We, as an organization, could fundraise and hire contractors to come in and do kind of, targeted treatment of certain invasives. We could have them come and remove trash at periodic intervals, things like that. But ultimately, that doesn't really create any kind of long-term or sustainable impacts for the community. Really, the idea behind people-powered restoration is to be able to get our community members involved in this direct restoration work, be able to build connections to place in Rock Creek and Rock Creek Park, to really make people feel like it's a place that they are welcome, that they feel at home in, that they want to be able to protect. And then in addition to kind of building those connections and building that sense of community around Rock Creek, we lean into that to be able to leverage kind of a community stewardship ethic, to be able to educate Rock Creek community members, visitors to the parks, volunteers about how to best take care of this really precious resource in the middle of this large urban area. And we do that through a variety of different volunteer and community kind of driven programs. Since 2008, which is I think when the Conservancy started counting our volunteer contributions, we've had over 40,000 volunteers. And I think probably by the end of 2021, we'll be just about at 45,000. So we can update some of these slides. And there's a number of volunteer programs that we have to be able to facilitate this work. The first one is our Stream Team Leader program, which I know Liam on the call is a part of. Stream Team Leaders are community ambassadors for Rock Creek, and particularly with a focus on stormwater issues. So through that training, volunteers will learn about kind of the threat that stormwater and stormwater runoff poses to Rock Creek. They'll learn different stewardship principles, including some of these Recreate Responsibly principles that we'll go through more in depth today. And then also learn how to lead their own cleanup events in the park to help remove litter and help to otherwise interact with their communities, to host events, help with advocacy, and otherwise help take care of Rock Creek. The Weed Warrior program is a program that we host in very close partnership with Rock Creek Park to be able to train and permit volunteers to remove invasive species within Rock Creek, within the federal park. Invasive species are one of the top kind of primary threats to particularly the forest health in Rock Creek. Invasive plants are, if you're not aware, basically just plants that are not supposed to be here. Plants that for one reason or another have been brought from other areas of the world where they are native and where they do thrive. They're brought into our region or to our area and our parks. And because of certain climate changes or other kind of adaptable characteristics, those plants really take over the surrounding environments. They can completely cover all of the ground space, decimate some of the understory that's there in the forest, and also climb up trees through vines and be able to choke and kill a lot of the forest. So being able to remove these invasive plants is really important work within our parks, and our weed warriors are especially trained to be able to really tackle that problem head on. Our Rock Creek Conservation Corps program is our summer youth employment program that we host for 6 weeks from June to August every year. We work primarily with high schoolers in DC, and this year we added a crew in Montgomery County as well to be able to learn and work kind of in depth with us, learning about stormwater issues, about invasive plant removal, about community engagement and what it means to be a good steward and a good neighbor to Rock Creek. And the idea is that this is kind of a long-term intensive form of people-powered restoration. These students are really transformed into lifelong Rock Creek stewards after participating in this program. And we have a lot of students who come back and will continue to participate, students who go on to become park rangers or major in environmental science in college. So it's really exciting to be able to work with those young people, really help to foster that sense of connection to Rock Creek, that sense of love for Rock Creek, and then being able to equip them with those stewardship skills moving forward. Our bacteria monitors program is in partnership with Anacostia Riverkeeper in DC and with Potomac Riverkeeper in the Montgomery County portion of the watershed. We have weekly volunteer opportunities for bacteria monitor volunteers to go out to different sites within either the national park or within Montgomery parks along Rock Creek and be able to take water samples just to see kind of what the water quality in Rock Creek looks like. Spoiler, and we'll get into this, but it is not great. So we will show some of the data that is actually collected by our bacteria monitors, but it's a really great opportunity to be able to get out into the park, to get up close to the water, to really understand and do a little bit of citizen science work to help continue to develop the understanding of how Rock Creek is doing and begin identifying some of the ways that we can work to improve it. And then finally, if you're not looking for something as long-term or such a commitment to be able to volunteer with us, we also host every single Saturday out in Rock Creek Park different volunteer opportunities. So every single Saturday you can find us at one of our 5 mini oasis sites, which are kind of our targeted demonstration restoration sites throughout the national park. We often are doing either invasive plant removals, litter cleanups, or since it's planting season, later this month, we'll also be doing a lot of native plantings at a few sites throughout the park. So there are always ongoing opportunities to be able to get involved, to be able to learn more about particular issues or threats to Rock Creek that you might be interested in, and get plugged into this work in some capacity or another.
Just to add to that briefly, we don't want to take anyone away from existing volunteer work that they're doing, because we know that people are very committed and we really appreciate everything that you're already doing. But if there is someone who doesn't have a task already and they're interested, we are looking for Rock Creek rovers that will hike through Rock Creek Park, answer visitors' questions, and assist visitors in the field as well. And so that's another opportunity in addition.
Definitely. And Susan in particular, but any of you, if you're interested in getting involved in these programs, definitely just get in contact with me and Dana. And we are more than happy to share information on upcoming trainings and otherwise information on how to plug into this work. So that's kind of a quick overview of Rock Creek Park and Rock Creek Conservancy and some of the work that we do and kind of the scope of our mission. From here, we're going to shift gears a little bit and get into some of the stewardship principles that we're going to review with you all tonight. First, we're just going to touch kind of quickly on these leave no trace principles. I think these are probably familiar to most of you. I think just as kind of basic conservation principles, things that are introduced to most people, just as people who are interested in the environment and protecting it. So these are pretty common things that you'll see around at the national parks and on websites in terms of just how to be a good kind of steward to the public lands that you're visiting. So some of these reminders that fall into these leave no trace principles are number 1, to plan ahead and prepare. So in our case, that means checking the Rock Creek Park website, seeing if there's any closures, selecting a route, making sure that you're staying on designated trails. So taking a look at that park map and kind of finding which trail you want to go on for that particular adventure. Respecting wildlife is another important one. We are visitors in wildlife's home. It's their homes, their ecosystems that we are there visiting and enjoying. So it's always important to be able to respect the wildlife that you see, to view wildlife from a distance, never getting too close or touching animals or anything like that, and also not feeding or enticing wildlife. It's very important to dispose of any waste when you're out and about in public lands. The pack in, pack out is kind of the language that's typically used around this principle. So anything that you bring into the park, make sure that you bring it back out. If you want to pick things up along the way, that's also a really great bonus, but always make sure to remove any litter that you see, and that includes pet waste. So making sure that you're bagging and removing pet waste as well. Leave what you find. I like this little quote as kind of an easy way to remind this, but take only pictures, leave only footprints. We are there to enjoy the natural beauty, and that natural beauty is there for everyone to be able to come and experience and appreciate. So if we're taking things out with us every single time we go and visit, not only does that harm the park and resources, but that also undermines the ability for other people to be able to go in and enjoy those things. So always making sure that you are limiting the kind of impacts that you have on the spaces that you're visiting. Got a few more. These last ones are respecting other visitors. So not only are we needing to be respectful of the wildlife that are living there, but also other people are also visiting these spaces to be able to enjoy and appreciate that experience. So in particular, I think this was an important one, thinking about the pandemic in the last year and a half, being able to social distance on trails, making sure that you are being respectful of one another, not intruding on other people's experiences or assuming that your version of how to experience a park is the correct version. There are lots of different ways to enjoy our parks. Staying on durable surfaces is really important. So hiking and camping in kind of the designated areas is really important. In Rock Creek Park, this is primarily thinking about sticking to designated trails and not going off trail or onto social trails. Being careful when you are on slippery surfaces, or if the weather is inclement, staying out of stream banks or other areas that might be tripping hazards or slipping hazards, things like that. And finally, minimizing campfire impacts. In Rock Creek Park, this is primarily seen in kind of the grilling areas that are available. There are picnic areas that have grills and fire pits available, and that's really wonderful. And we hope that people take advantage of those, but always make sure that you are extinguishing your fires very thoroughly. You're not leaving any food or trash in the area surrounding it, and otherwise just kind of making sure that you are limiting the impact of that experience. Anything to add to that, Dana? You needed.
Just to add in briefly, when people do ask us for information about camping, since we don't allow it at Rock Creek Park, we generally refer them to places like Greenbelt, although you always want to check their website in advance to see if everything is open as it should be. Prince William Forest Park and Catoctin Mountain Park.
That's great to know. So the leave no trace principles are kind of your basic conservation principles, things that you always want to be keeping in mind, regardless of what outdoor public land space you're visiting, just kind of key principles to keep in mind.
This is just a scene from the Recreate Responsibly campaign that the National Park Service had. You can see that this is also engaged in COVID times. Know before you go. Obviously, you heard a lot of those basic things already in the leave no trace principles. Keep it close was also designed to have people recreate locally as ways to not potentially go far in a field and look at COVID transmission rates and all of those types of things and engage in that. Knowing your limits, that's always important wherever you go. And making sure that you bring with you what you brought, take back what you brought with you. Make sure you pack it in, pack it out, which we already talked about. And keep your distance, which was designed to encourage people to be socially distant of one another. But we do have a national Recreate Responsibly campaign, and it does include a lot of the next basic things that you're going to see in this slide program. And we took a lot of those things and made it local. That's what you'll see in this piece.
Exactly. So the Recreate Responsibly campaign was really developed at the national level for the National Park Service to be able to kind of broadly speak to some of the issues that we were seeing in our national parks. The Recreate Responsibly campaign, as it exists in Rock Creek Park, has been a partnership with the Conservancy and the park. Really, like Dana said, being able to focus on some of the kind of unique challenges that we've seen in Rock Creek Park, particularly as an urban park. It gets used in slightly different ways than a place like Yosemite or Yellowstone might be used. So these specific messages were developed in terms of some of the practices of harm or other things that were damaging the park, particularly around the beginning of the pandemic. So these are a few of our signs, and we'll go through each of these principles each by each.
The National Park Service has a mask policy, and that means that if you're indoors, you must wear a mask. If you're outdoors and you can't stay socially distanced, you must wear a mask as well.
The next kind of key principle that we've honed in on for this campaign is encouraging people to stay off of social trails and to stay on designated park trails. So just to kind of illustrate what a social trail is, over here on the left side, you can see just the regular designated park trail map. All these yellow lines are the official park trails that are kept and maintained by Park Service staff. You see that there's still kind of these large swaths of forest over here that allow kind of refuge for animals and for wildlife in the area, things like that are very important to be able to maintain. Over here on the right side, this additional layer of the pink lines are the social trails that are present in the park. So as you can see, these really cut through a lot of kind of the major preserved areas of forest. A lot of them are either really short kinds of little shortcuts, people that are just trying to get to a trail more quickly from wherever they live or wherever they're visiting from. Some of them are shortcuts kind of across a particular area if they don't want to go all the way around. Some of them are around certain landmarks that you might run into in the park. So a lot of times these trails really are created out of convenience, but that doesn't make them any less harmful. Social trails are non-official trails that, as I've said before, really fragment the forest. They kind of push in between and create trampled down sections of the forest that we're really working to protect. They can make it easier for invasive plants to be able to get into these spaces and be able to spread more easily by trampling down into the soil and kind of eliminating some of the other plants and wildlife that might be in that area. And it's also an opportunity to trample on the really sensitive and important native plants that we're working hard to protect in our forests. In addition to just the impacts on forest health, as I mentioned, wildlife really do need these kind of intact sections of forest to be able to find refuge in. If people are constantly just kind of trampling through their home, they don't have the same kind of nesting and breeding areas. It might be more difficult for them to find food. A lot of their kind of daily routines and habits tend to be interrupted by people just cutting across through where their typical routes are. So it's really important to stay off of social trails when you see them and to stay on designated trails. You can always tell a designated park trail by either finding a blaze painted on a tree. So that's just like the painted line that you'll see on a lot of trees in the park, or by seeing an actual like trailhead sign that tells you where you're going and kind of what the other available paths are. We also always recommend either checking the website to be able to look at the map or bringing a park map with you so that you don't get lost and know that you're staying on those designated trails.
So a lot of people don't realize that nothing can be tied to trees in a national park site. And that's not just Rock Creek Park, but that includes hammocks, slack lines, piñatas, rope swings, all of the above. Doing that on park trees can actually harm it. If you think about the bark of a tree as the skin of the tree, things like that cut into the skin of the tree, and that can do a lot of different things. It can allow fungi and bacteria. It can allow, it can actually, in severe cases, can actually affect the circulatory system of the tree as well, affecting its ability to get food. So just keep that in mind. We've even seen where people try to tie hammocks onto trees that are so small that it literally permanently bends these trees over time into an entirely different shape than they should be. So those things are not allowed to be tied to trees in the park. Does that mean that they're not allowed? Well, if they're freestanding, meaning they can stand on their own, like the hammock that you see in this sign, or freestanding slack lines, then they're allowed in the open grassy areas of the park.
So the next principle is what we call stay dry, stay safe, basically just meaning not to make contact with the water. Like I said earlier, Rock Creek is unfortunately very polluted. There are very high levels of bacteria, and this is constantly kind of reaffirmed through the bacteria monitor water samples that are taken each week throughout the summer. Rock Creek is the most polluted waterway in the DC region, so it's more polluted than the Potomac River and more polluted than the Anacostia River, which does tend to surprise some people. So kind of bottom line is that you should not ever be making contact with Rock Creek, unfortunately. As tempting and as relaxing as it might seem, it is a public health concern ultimately. And that goes for obviously adults, but also for children and pets. You know, it's not safe to have your dog running through that water either when there are high levels of E. coli and other bacteria. There is kind of aside from the public health concerns, which hopefully are enough motivation, but there is just a swim ban in Rock Creek. So it is actually illegal to swim or wade in the water. And a lot of that, again, does go back to the water quality concerns, but also that kind of scrambling up and down a stream bank to be able to get in and out of the creek also causes kind of restoration concerns. It can cause erosion along the stream banks. It can, you know, unsettle kind of tree roots and other things like that that are really important to be able to maintain the integrity of that landscape. And then I have some charts here to really show and illustrate exactly how bad the water quality is. So these were, I think, one of our very last samples for this field season for our bacteria monitor volunteers. This is the data that was collected by the DC volunteers, so in partnership with Anacostia Riverkeeper. And these results were posted every single week on Twitter through the Anacostia Riverkeeper portal. And there's also an Anacostia Riverkeeper website portal that you can go to. The website is down here to really see a kind of, you know, full scale throughout the summer look at what water quality looked like in Rock Creek. But we measured water quality with our volunteers at these 8 Rock Creek sites. And then there were additional volunteers going through the Anacostia and Potomac. But Rock Creek was consistently had higher levels of, again, E. coli and other bacteria pollutants. A lot of that comes from sewage runoff, unfortunately. Whenever we have big storms, a lot of that runoff overflows the kind of capacity of our sewage systems. And so a lot of that sewage water, unfortunately, goes directly into the creek. Pet waste that hasn't been picked up or thrown away or disposed of properly is another contributor to some of this. So there's a lot of different pollutants that really contribute to the high levels of bacteria that we're seeing. And pretty consistently, all of the Rock Creek sites fell within the moderate to high levels of E. coli. Only a few times were there any sites that were in the kind of low portion. So again, just to reiterate, we do not recommend that you make any kind of contact with the water. It is a public safety concern and it's just against the rules. What it's doing. There we go.
One of the other challenges in Rock Creek Park and in lots of the different national parks in Washington, D.C. area would be dogs off leash. We know that obviously they can frighten other park visitors. It can make them uncomfortable. You can often have interactions between dogs that potentially are not leashed, or at least if one dog's off leash, then the other one might be on a leash. So DC law says that dogs must be leashed at all times when outdoors, unless they're in a designated dog park. And there are no dog parks in Rock Creek Park, none whatsoever. DC regulations say that the US Park Police can write a ticket for a leash of more than 4 feet. So 4 feet long is considered the maximum dog leash in Washington, D.C. Normally in a national park, that would be a 6-foot number. So wandering dogs can do way more than affect other visitors. They can affect our wildlife. They can scare them, stress them. They can also chase them, unfortunately, and can also disrupt their regular feeding habits and their use of the habitat. Dogs off leash can also trample sensitive plants and other things as well, and can easily spread the seeds from invasive plants to many more areas in the parks. This is actually a sample of a first pilot pet waste station that we have at Fort Slocum Park. You can see that there are bags for people. Oftentimes people might come to the park and not have a bag with them, and they don't always pick up the poop. It is required that the poop is picked up while people are here. Pet waste, as you can see, contains bacteria and nutrients. It pollutes our soil and our waterways. We also do, for some reason, and maybe just because this is an urban area, sometimes we find bags of poop on the side of the trail, which is really odd because we don't have anyone who comes afterwards to pick up the poop along the trail. But somehow there seems to be a perception that that must be the case. What would likely be the case is that perhaps in the next big rain, that bag of poop washes downstream. So anyway, just a note, we don't have a poop fairy either. Nobody comes to pick up the bags afterwards.
The next kind of challenge that we see pretty frequently in the park is litter. Litter is the visible form of stormwater pollution. So as I mentioned earlier, when I was talking about the Stream Team Leader program, stormwater pollution really comes from stormwater runoff, which is basically anytime it rains, that water rushes over the impervious surfaces in our urban area, collects kind of all of the pollutants that it finds along the way. So that includes things like pet waste, like road salts or ice melts, things like your trash that collects along the side of the road, or any other kind of urban pollutants, including pesticides, fertilizers, and anything like that. So litter, again, is the visible form of that pollution. So there's a lot of other pollutants that are within that water as well. But all of that together really does threaten the health of particularly our water quality and our waterways in the park. So there's a few kind of reminders and kind of small actions that you can take as a park visitor and as a volunteer to be able to help reduce litter in our parks. Number one, as I said earlier, is to pack in and pack out. So anything that you take into the park, plan to take out of the park, making sure that you're not leaving anything behind and potentially even leaving things cleaner than you found. And that kind of ties into the second one. You can always go plogging whenever you're out visiting the park. Plogging is a Swedish term that basically just means kind of the combination of picking up trash while either hiking or jogging or running along a trail. The Conservancy does have an opportunity to register that service anytime that you do go out plogging or picking up trash as you go. We have what's called individual cleanups that are found on our calendar. And that is really great for us to be able to measure just to kind of understand the real impact of the Rock Creek community when you all are out doing this great work. So please do register with us if you ever do that work. We do recommend that everyone stay safe while picking up litter in the park if you choose to do so. So number one, first and foremost, we would always recommend wearing gloves, work gloves in particular. You never know what you're going to come into contact with or what you might touch. And I think this is particularly important given the context of the ongoing pandemic. Disposed face masks and gloves and other forms of PPE have become a lot more prevalent, and we see them pretty often when we're conducting litter cleanups, along with things like broken glass and shards of metal, things like that. So it's just always really safe to be able to wear gloves whenever you are planning on picking up litter. Something else I would want to highlight is micropollution. We see quite extensively a lot of micropollution whenever we're out conducting cleanups in the park, particularly around our picnic areas. Micropollutants can include very small things, often plastic particles like balloons or confetti pieces, things that are very small and very difficult to pick up. Those things are very easily washed into our waterways. Animals can eat them and pick them up that way. They work their way into our food chain. It can really do a lot of harm to both the environmental resources, the wildlife, and then kind of all of the different ecological factors in between. So micropollutants like balloons and confetti are banned from Rock Creek Park. That doesn't mean that they are not there. We still see them pretty frequently, particularly after like birthday parties and things like that. I think people really enjoy bringing piñatas to the park for their birthday parties, which always creates a mess. So please do not bring any micropollutants into the park. Don't celebrate in that way. Find other ways to be able to celebrate, your birthdays or other celebrations. So micropollutants are one of the harmful pieces of litter that we do see quite a bit of. And then the last note that I'll make here is there are occasional homeless encampments that you can run into while in the park. We recommend that you do not engage with these areas. They are considered hazardous waste sites just because you don't know what kinds of things you might find there, including things like human waste or sometimes needles and things like that that can be dangerous. So we, again, encourage not engaging with that site. If it seems to be some kind of threat or danger, you can call the non-emergency park police number, which we'll provide to you at the end of this training, just as a resource to be able to alert somebody of the concern in the area. but otherwise you should not be engaging with that.
Just to pass it along, even National Park Service maintenance employees do not clean up homeless encampments. There actually are private companies that come in to be able to do that because of potential high levels of waste, human waste, and other things as well. So yeah, definitely stay away from those locations. We have had some issues in the recent past, especially during COVID times, but occasionally otherwise, where people aren't parking where they're supposed to. People must park in designated lots and spaces to help protect the park resources. As you can imagine, so many more people found Rock Creek Park during COVID-19. And we had people pulled up on the side of the road onto the grass, sometimes in front of trailheads, sometimes blocking access points for other visitors, sometimes literally making it impossible for another visitor to back out from where they parked in a normal designated space. Improperly, cars can cause a lot of issues, accessibility issues, safety issues, especially for pedestrians, cyclists, and emergency vehicles. And so sometimes you'll see that we have real estate style signs in the park that also say no parking as well. This year has been a lot better from that perspective, but last year was wow, wild, really wild.
So that was kind of our quick overview of some basic conservation principles, as well as more specifically the Recreate Responsibly principles that we've kind of identified in partnership that are really challenges that Rock Creek Park as an urban park has been facing. So before we switch gears and get into kind of how to communicate about these things, I just want to pause really quick and see if there's any questions about anything that we've covered.
No, it's very helpful. I find myself, I'm thinking about the social trails part of it, because I've walked, a lot around, and I'm sure I've been on just social trails because so many of them must be very well worn that you don't realize really you're off of it. It's off of a designated trail until you're on it. So
yeah,
that's very true, Susan. Yeah, very true.
I will say also, I think that's one of the ones, maybe other than keeping dogs on leashes, that's probably the one that we get the most pushback on. I think people get really attached to the trails that they take, which is understandable. Those are familiar routes and passageways, but they just don't realize the kind of harm that taking those trails does create. So yes, I think the best way to kind of mitigate that, because I also don't always know, if I'm on a trail or a social trail, because like you said, they are pretty well worn, is either keeping a map on me so I can navigate a little bit more easily, or always just kind of keeping a keen eye for, trail signs and blazes.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, so I'm going to keep going, but again, if there's any questions, especially since we have such a small group tonight, feel free to interrupt and ask questions at any point. So for here, we're going to shift into a little bit of how to communicate about these principles. Obviously just knowing them is very important so that you yourself and, your kind of everyday visitation and enjoyment of the parks, you can make sure that you're avoiding those things. But ideally, as Rock Creek community members, being able to spread this awareness and some of these messages is really important. We do so through a signage campaign. We have Recreate Responsibly signs that are out throughout the park, but there really is nothing else like a kind of a trusted person that you are interfacing with, somebody that you can actually talk face to face with and answer questions or whatever it might be. So we really do rely on our volunteers and community members to help us spread this awareness. So a few things, if you ever see somebody who is not following one of these rules, or if you want to be able to provide that kind of education and awareness, some best practices to keep in mind. Number one is always assume that a visitor doesn't know whatever the appropriate practice is. Don't assume that they are willfully breaking a rule or doing so maliciously. A lot of times people just don't know, the impacts that certain behaviors can have on our parks. So always approach it from a place of education and, kind of assuming the best in that person. Kind of on that same note, always approaching people in these conversations very warmly and very positively. Again, you never want to make it seem, punitive or like you're coming to attack them, because that's not the case. Really, at the end of the day, kind of our mutual goal as a community is to keep these park resources safe and to keep each other safe and our wildlife safe. So always kind of approaching it from that, place of good intent. One option for kind of what this can look like is to politely engage with that person, say hello, wave, whatever it might be, kind of make yourself known so you're not surprising them. And then just say kind of in a matter of fact type of way, hey, did you know that it's actually against the rules for a dog to be off leash? This shares the information or whatever the kind of stewardship principle is without making it feel personal, without making it feel like an attack or like you're trying to come for that person. You're just saying like, hey, did you know that this is what it is? So being able to share that in, again, kind of a matter of fact way, not a kind of, you're doing this wrong or something like that, being able to share it in a pretty neutral way, I think is important when you're starting these conversations. We also recommend if you are out in the park as a volunteer, if you're out there leading a cleanup event, or if you're doing an individual cleanup, or if you're a trained weed warrior and you're out just removing invasives one day, we do recommend wearing either Rock Creek Conservancy or Rock Creek Park National Park Service identifying gear. We do provide shirts, hats, masks, kind of dependent on whatever program you're in. There's usually some kind of swag that comes along with it that's either branded for the Conservancy or for the park. So we do encourage that you wear these pieces when you're out and about in the park, just to be able to lend a little bit of authority to your messaging. Or if you're not, kind of the alternative for this, if you're not wearing something or something isn't clean or whatever it might be, you can also include that in kind of the as you're approaching somebody, so like, hey, I'm a volunteer in the park, I work here pretty often, and this is actually an area that we see a lot of concern. So being able to share it in that kind of neutral way.
And just also to add to that, one of the things that we often do as park staff is to approach people and have a conversation. And it might be, oh, hey, what a beautiful dog. Wow. What kind of dog is it? Or it might be, hey, are you out for a hike today? Do you have a favorite hike in the park? Is there a special place, is there like a special place you like to enjoy? I mean, as long as you do it in a way that's not creepy, of course. But, and like, just have a chat. Hey, did you hear that bird? Or whatever. There's a way to warm up your audience, so to speak, and to interact with people in a way that makes it a very friendly encounter. I oftentimes will start with the friendly part of the encounter, and then, hey, a lot of people don't realize that we're not allowed to have dogs off of a leash in a national park, and they don't understand the details of why. And then that kind of opens the door to more conversation. So the other side of it is it's important to appeal to what people care about. And in the case of dogs, for example, oftentimes they care a lot about the safety of their dog. So, by keeping your dog on a leash, we can, it helps make sure that your dog won't out of instinct chase after a deer. Oftentimes we've had not every day or every moment of every day, but animals have been lost because they ran away and chased after an animal here in this park. And in some cases, they haven't been found. In some cases, they've been hit by vehicles. And there are other animals in the park. Rabies is a natural part of the environment. Things can happen when animals interact or animals are loose. Keep in mind that cost is generally not a deterrent. So when we think about dogs off leash, for example, DC tickets, the tickets that are given out generally go for about $50, which to me, $50 is a lot of money, but not to everyone. So, and those tickets also tend not to be taken as seriously when they're taken to court. So just keep that in mind. In those ways, it really is important that we use honey and not vinegar to help get our messages across with the public. Keep the situation lighthearted. Can you interact with the dog and go, ooh, hey, who let your human off of a leash today? Who let your person off of a leash? Or, just like make a joke, do something funny. That often will take down someone's guard when they would be frustrated if someone just said, hey, do you know that your dog has to be on a leash? Some people might react differently in different settings and situations and with different personalities. So just keep those things in mind and pay really close attention to body language of the person when you're dealing with them. So we'll talk a little more about that later.
So instead of breakout rooms tonight, because we have such a small group, if you all are willing, we can just do kind of a conversation through some of this. Normally we would break out into groups and kind of chat through, different ideas or things that have tried and have either been successful or unsuccessful, that kind of thing. So, I'm curious if you all have experience with kind of any of the situations that we've talked through. If there have been any, we can start, I guess, with any challenges that you faced in trying to communicate these kinds of messages with folks.
I know Anna has.
Yeah, I mean, I've had experiences in the parks before where, especially with fishermen, folks who are fishing along the shoreline, and some of them leave their waste in plastic bags. They tie up the plastic bag and leave it on the shore. And so there was one morning where I was speaking to a gentleman on the shore, and I was out there, I think, scouting for a cleanup or some volunteer activity, and we were kind of talking about, what do I do? And I told him, what I did, and he said, "Oh wow, that's great. Thank you for everything." And we got into conversation, and I was talking about the amount of trash that we were collecting, and he said, "So do you pay people to come and pick up the trash?" And I said, "No, this is actually a trash-free park." And I explained to him what a trash-free park meant. He went, "Oh, I thought that, somebody was going to come and pick up the trash. So I decided to leave it because I didn't want to have them lose their job." Which is totally actually understandable, because people in certain parks in certain areas, you're employed to have people come and pick up litter throughout the park. So I totally got what he was talking about. So that I didn't take it as an option for me to go like, "What do you mean?" Like, like people don't respond to that. It's just not knowing the rules and regulations of the park and why a park is a trash-free park. And so just in conversation with the person, they were able to understand that they needed to take the waste out with them, and that they weren't going to be taking away someone's work by doing that.
That's a really interesting perspective. I mean, none of the parks I've worked in have been trash-free parks. So it's not an answer I've actually even heard from someone, but that's very interesting.
Well, that was at C&O Canal. So that's, and so when you talk to people about, when you say, "Oh, this is a trash-free park," they don't really understand what a trash-free park is. And so then you talk about the leave no trace principle, pack it in, pack it out. You'll see bags at different stations throughout the park for people to bag their waste and then take it out with them. But it sounds counterintuitive, but actually, I think I remember looking at this when I was working with bridging, is, the amount of litter that's found at parks that have trash cans, that have waste receptacles, is actually way higher than at parks that are trash-free parks.
Interesting.
So, yeah.
I think that's a really good example of kind of giving somebody the benefit of the doubt. I think you definitely went through like that, initial kind of conversation piece to keep it friendly and get to know the person, but him really having just a completely different perception of what was going on and how he was trying to be helpful. So I think that's a really good example of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyone else?
Or Liam, any examples or challenges that you've had when trying to communicate about some of these things?
No, I mean, no, but I have witnessed it on some neighborhood listservs. There have been at various times discussions about, hiking in Rock Creek Park, and especially related to dogs. And people who have had experiences of, running into someone who had a dog off leash, and when they said, and they've been threatened by the dog, or their dog has been attacked by the dog, and when they say something to these other people, it's not taken well. And I can see why that would be just a difficult thing to do, because people get kind of wacky about their dogs and their dog's right to have freedom. And so.
Are there specific listservs that you've seen that on?
Oh, well, let's see. I'm on, I don't remember which one. I'm on the community, Chevy Chase one. I'm on the Cleveland Park listserv, and I'm on the Tenleytown listserv. So I honestly don't remember which one they are, but they all sort of run into, Rock Creek. So
Mhm.
I don't remember which one, but yeah, I just remember when I was reading that thinking, wow, that could be, an angry dog owner. But maybe if you're wearing park gear, they would be a little less angry, or Rock Creek Conservancy gear or something.
It definitely helps when you have that extra clothing that identifies with an organization.
Yeah.
I think it definitely helps.
I think also recognizing, not all people are dog people. I don't own dogs. I generally like dogs, but I don't always want them climbing all over me. There are some people with really genuine fears of dogs
Oh,
or have
yeah.
been hurt by dogs. Dogs that have been attacked by other dogs. Like there's a lot of, I guess I can understand like my dog should have the freedom to be able to, run free or whatever it might be. But also recognizing that like me as a visitor should have the freedom to be able to go and enjoy a park without being scared or without feeling like I'm in danger or without feeling like my dog that I'm bringing is in danger. I think that there's, especially if you're in a city and you're sharing these kind of public lands and these highly densely populated areas, like you need to be able to be a responsible dog owner at the end of the day.
Now, that makes absolute sense. The problem is that you run into people who are not the responsible dog owners. So,
Right.
that's just where the challenge would come in.
Right.
Yeah. And that's where, doing it in a way that assumes that they don't already know the rules. Now, there are definitely some people who do know the rules, but assuming that they don't starts off on a good note. Engaging in conversation that's not about the dog initially is helpful. Using that sense of humor and, trying to do it in a way that's just very neighborly makes a difference.
Mhm.
Yeah, a huge difference. I mean, there definitely are stories, and not of rangers that this happens to, but stories of people who tell someone to put their dog on a leash and then they get flipped off or cussed at or whatever. That certainly does happen, but doing it in different ways can make a big difference in how it's taken by the visitor. And
As
wearing gear helps.
I'm sorry, as a volunteer, if you're in there, not doing, you're not walking the trails, or you're in there, say, sampling water, and you see someone breaking this, I am assuming that you ask that as a volunteer, you convey these messages all the time. Is that correct?
That's the hope. I
Okay.
think that it can be contextual, if it either, you're far away or, like if it, for whatever logistical reason, it doesn't make sense or,
Right.
sometimes I think you can just tell that somebody, not tell, but, some people are a little bit more aggressive in terms of how they respond to those kinds of things. So if it seems like it's a situation that might get into that, then it is maybe not always worth it. But I do think that whenever you do see somebody and it feels like an opportunity to have that conversation, we definitely encourage you to take advantage of that.
Great. Thank you.
And after this piece of the conversation, we will get into de-escalation. So if you approach a situation and it quickly turns bad, we have some recommendations also on kind of how to manage that.
Great. Thank you.
Absolutely. And I would also say, you are really ambassadors for the National Park Service and for Rock Creek Conservancy as well. And, the goal is to try to address the issue when possible. However, if at any point you feel unsafe, do not approach or exit gracefully. And we'll again talk more about that in a moment.
Yeah. At the end of the day, your safety is always our topmost priority.
Yeah.
One thing that I'll just kind of add into the conversation we were having about, how to, I guess, appease dog owners or how to kind of make it a little bit more friendly in terms of how that conversation is framed. Somebody last week in this training mentioned that there are a couple local areas that you can bring your dogs and have them run off leash, and they're more contained, but they might be a couple acres, kind of large to be able to provide that space that's larger than just like a regular dog park that you might find in the city. So a couple of the ones that she recommended last week were Rosedale Conservancy, the Congressional Cemetery, which I did not realize, and also Wheaton Regional Park in Montgomery County has a pretty large dog park as a component of that as well.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think knowing those resources or having like a little list in your pocket or whatever that might look like, to be able to share, hey, like here is not a good place to do that because of XYZ, but there are other places nearby that you can bring your dog and be able to do that. So I think being able to provide additional resources instead of just saying no, you can say like, no, but here are some other places you can go.
I do want to mention, we got a really nice little note via email the other day. And this is a really nice success story. It was from someone, and I won't name the person, but the person says, I've lived in DC since 1969. I've been walking my dogs in Rock Creek Park since 1988. My own dogs, not the family pet when I was a kid. Always off leash, always. And she mentions the name of a park employee, has several times talked with me about why I should keep my dogs on their leash. He is kind, patient, full of great information, a good listener. I have no idea why the third time he explained to me that my dogs are actually harming certain animals and spreading invasive species, that it got into my skull, but it did. I'm now fully reformed. And she mentions the name of her dogs and I are tethered together every day when we walk in the woods. I should have listened earlier. One of my closest friends, and she names another person who was another National Park Service employee who's retired now, tried in his gentle way to get me to leash my mutts. But man, I could be stubborn. I just wanted you to let you know that, and she named the employee, is a very special ranger. And I actually learned things. So dogs on a leash, it's a little less fun, but it feels good to know that I'm peacefully coexisting with critters I couldn't identify if my life depended upon it, because in the end, my life does depend upon it. And then it was a nice thank you for keeping Rock Creek Park as their happy place, as this person's happy place. So that was a really wonderful note to get. And I just wanted to mention that, it can make a difference. It might not make a difference the first time or the second time or the third time, but eventually it will.
It's worth a try, definitely.
That's awesome.
Very cool.
Wasn't that great?
Yeah,
That was freaking fabulous.
I know. Makes it worth it.
Yeah. I mean, those are the letters you don't get every day.
Yeah.
We're just grateful if we can change the behavior.
Yep.
A couple other things. I've been taking notes and we've hosted a few of these sessions at this point. So I've been taking notes on just interesting ideas that folks have had in other sessions. So a few other things that I want to share is kind of success stories and how folks have kind of been creatively able to communicate around some of this. We had one volunteer who is very active in her community and is, I think, a kind of well-known face. She's out and about. She volunteers a lot in the park. She wrote a nice little kind of informal blog post for her next door listserv and posted it there. Framed it very positively, very upbeat, really framed it as, kind of the connection to Rock Creek and that place of respite that we've all been really relying on this past, 2 years in particular, but well beyond that as well. So she kind of framed it in terms of, we're helping to protect Rock Creek, we're helping to protect the really special wildlife that is here and this, really important resource in the middle of this urban area that we're so lucky to have. And so again, keeping it very educational, very positively framed. And she said that as she was going on her own walks with her own dog in the community, people would stop her and say, thank you so much. I haven't really known how to approach this or what to say. And now, not only is that publicly kind of posted for folks to be able to read within her community, but it also informs the people who then can take those kind of nuggets of information around stewardship and then continue to share those messages. So I think, little pieces like that, like Susan, you mentioned that you're a part of a couple of different listservs, being able to compile short little notes to those kinds of spaces, even if they don't always get that kind of immediate feedback that she mentioned, I think really do go a long way and help to provide that education at the very least.
Yeah, absolutely. And we are looking at additional ways. I mean, this year and last year, we've worked, National Park Service and Rock Creek Conservancy have worked together to create the sign program. We've also had more staff out than usual, doing what we call roving in the park, which is interacting with the visitors more directly, which is something that we sometimes have less people to do when we actually have to run another facility on top of it. So we've had the chance to do that. We also have worked the National Park Service with Rock Creek Conservancy on some Recreate Responsibly events. Do you want to talk a little bit about those, Elena?
Yeah. So this summer we piloted a series of programs called Summer in the Parks. These were really kind of harken back to a series of programs that the National Park Service ran in the 60s and 70s, really as a way to kind of bring the community in DC together in our really sacred public lands. So this year we kind of put a spin on those types of programs. They were definitely community engagement programs, opportunity to meet members of the Rock Creek community and get them more familiar with their local park spaces. But kind of the undercurrent of all of that programming was this Recreate Responsibly campaign. So a lot of the booths and tables and activities that we had, both for the Conservancy and for Rock Creek Park, were things that related to really helping people to understand why these principles are important and how to kind of better live in attune with the park, be a good neighbor to the park. I'll let you talk, Dana, about the kind of balloon sampling thing that you you and the Rangers put together. But I think just being able to show people that, there are ways to be in the park responsibly, be in the park in a kind of harmonious way where we're still protecting the resources, we're still protecting the wildlife, but we're still also just having a lot of fun is definitely possible. But I think, yeah, the balloon exhibit that you all put together was probably one of the best pieces to demonstrate that.
Yeah, two of my team members, Alexi McHugh, a park guide, and Anna Sanchez, our Latino heritage intern, put together this awesome exhibit, literally where they spent several hours each, along with other staff members, just picking up the micropollutants. And it's amazing to be able to share that and say, look, it took us 12 hours and we got this much stuff, right? And just imagine how much more there is when there are micropollutants and they're just so tiny and so small and so easily washed into our waterways and so easily in the stomachs of our fish and things like that. I think it really helped to help tell that story in a way that people might not have really thought about. Oh, you mean when I bring that out here, it takes somebody that long and sometimes there's no one to pick it up? Just the water will pick it up. That's crazy. So yeah, I think that was a really effective exhibit.
I agree. Any other kind of creative methods to communicate these messages that you all either have tried or might want to recommend?
Well, just to let you know, we also have some additional creative minds on it. In addition to all the great stuff we're working on with the Rock Creek Conservancy, which also includes videos about recreating responsibly. We're also working with Worcester Polytechnic Institute group of students, and they come on a special project and they bring students of different disciplines together to think about issues that they can help solve and provide ideas and recommendations for. And this group of students will be working on the dog off leash recreate responsibly aspect as well, to provide some additional recommendations that we can look at and possibilities for the future. We also do have a dogs off leash regional group that covers different parks that are managed by National Mall and Memorial Parks and by another set of parks known as National Capital Parks East. And again, we're all working to try to work on the dog off leash issue in that particular case. So you should be seeing some more things coming out of those aspects as well.
There aren't any more immediate suggestions. We can keep going, but do feel free. Again, we'll have only a few more slides, but feel free if there's anything else that comes up or any other ideas to share that with us. So kind of the last section of things that we're going to go over tonight is these de-escalation strategies. Like we were saying, generally it is, what we recommend or kind of our encouragement to be able to have these conversations with folks that you're interacting with in the park, whether that's, your own friends and neighbors that you're visiting with or other park users that you might encounter when you're out and about, either on your own personal time or working as a volunteer for either the park or for the Conservancy. Sometimes, unfortunately, these conversations do not always go well. People can get defensive sometimes or take things personally. So I think talking through these de-escalation strategy is important, just in case a situation like that does arise, to make sure that you are prepared and equipped for that situation. So to start out, we're going to talk through this kind of slow model that the National Park Service uses and trains rangers in. So I think it's been proven to be pretty successful in encounters like these. But the first kind of bullet point on this model is the S, so stay cool. First and foremost, it's important not to take whatever reaction you might be receiving personally. It can be hard to do sometimes. People can really get under your skin. They might be getting in your face or getting loud. But if you kind of meet that in kind, it'll really only serve to escalate the situation. So it's important to kind of stay cool, stay calm, keeping a composed kind of tone of voice, your level of voice also, keeping your your own volume a little bit lower than that person's is usually a good way to kind of demonstrate that, kind of calmer, more serene approach to things. And your body language is also very important, making sure that it is, kind of non-aggressive, kind of open. You're not just like crossing your arms or taking steps closer to them, whatever that might be, that could be taken as something that could escalate that situation. So first and foremost, taking a deep breath, make sure that you're able to stay cool in that situation is important.
Absolutely. And, just a side note, does anybody know how much of communication are the words that you say? Like there's an actual percentage on it. Does anybody know what that is?
It's like 10%.
Ooh, you're very close.
20?
Nope, lower.
Oh.
7%. 7% of your communication would be the words that you say.
Wow.
The highest amount of your communication is your body language. That's the biggest part of it. And also your tone of voice. So second of all, the other most important thing in the slow model, the L, is listen. Really listen to what someone's telling you. You can actually listen to someone and you can give them feedback summarizing what you've heard without agreeing with them necessarily. Like, hey, all right, I get that I understand from what I understand, you're telling me that you're upset because of this and this and this. And, sometimes that's all it takes to diffuse someone's anger or frustration, because they at least feel like you've listened to them. That's critical.
And kind of building off of that, I think the O kind of piggybacks nicely to offer validation. So again, as Dana said, that doesn't mean necessarily agreeing with whatever this person is saying. You don't have to agree with their words or their beliefs or whatever they are telling you, but being able to at least validate whatever kind of emotion they're experiencing. So saying, I understand that it's frustrating, or I understand it can be challenging, or I know your dog probably wants to go running, but kind of being able to validate that, but then really reinforce your initial message is important. So, kind of acknowledge how they're feeling, validate that, but at the end of the day, still be able to kind of set limits around what that looks like.
Mm-hmm. And as I said earlier, keep in mind that you need to really, really watch the body language of the person that you're dealing with. Listen to the tone of their voice. That may or may not match their words necessarily. So, it's important to know when to walk away. The W is know when to walk away. Sometimes no matter what you say, you're not going to calm someone down. Maybe they've had a really bad day. Maybe there's something else going on in their life. Maybe they really are this passionate about that particular issue. Nothing is worth taking it to a level where you would be unsafe. You are the most important aspect of this. Your safety is the most important. So if indeed you feel that the conversation is going nowhere, just say, well, I can see that we aren't going to agree on this. I wish you a good day. Turn around and walk away. If what they're doing is so extremely harmful, like we do want to know when dogs are off of the leash, don't call the park police in front of them. Obviously, go to a place where you're safe, where they're not going to hear you. Feel free to call the park police and let them know if somebody's running a dog off of a leash. But nothing is worth your safety, nothing at all.
So that's the slow model and kind of the 4 letters and each of those components of that model. This first note here, I think, is important to mention, though, that while can make sense to walk through that model kind of in order of those 4 components. It does not necessarily have to be done in that order. So if you enter a situation and it immediately starts to feel unsafe, you can immediately tell that this person is really going to escalate things, or it's just not a productive conversation to have. You can immediately walk away. You don't need to necessarily walk through those additional steps and continue trying to have that conversation if it's just not going to go anywhere, or if it is a safety concern. So if it makes sense to follow them in that order, you can definitely do so. And I think that they build in kind of a natural way, but also feel free to pick and choose depending on whatever that situation calls for.
And I would also add that, feel free to walk away if indeed you feel that you yourself are getting upset about it, because that's going to show through in your conversation with the person. So maybe they're upset and you can tell you're starting to feel like you're going to be upset. Yeah, it's not worth it. You don't need to go into a potential confrontation from that perspective. What I want you to think about is this is not a confrontation in any way, shape, or form. What we're approaching is a conversation with people, a conversation about behavior within the park in a friendly, polite, respectful manner. And that's the goal: conversation, not confrontation. So if you do find yourself in a situation where you do need assistance at any point in time, if you're on Rock Creek Park land for Rock Creek on the National Park Service land here in DC, you would call the park police number that's listed here, the 202-610-7500. And if you're in Montgomery Parks, any of the Rock Creek Regional Park land or other Montgomery Parks land in the Rock Creek Park watershed, Rock Creek watershed, you would dial the other 301 number that's listed here as well.
I honestly would encourage just saving these phone numbers in your phone if you plan to be out in the park regularly. They're definitely numbers that I've had to use, in various situations. I think it's just good to have on hand because you never know what you're going to encounter, what kind of things might happen when you're out and about. So it's always better to just be prepared and have that resource available to you.
And I
again,
keep it in both my personal and my work phones.
That's great.
Mhm.
And then just the other piece that I want to reiterate, and I know it's been said, but of course, these stewardship messages are really important, and we all obviously really deeply care about Rock Creek and being able to protect it. But at the end of the day, your safety really is the ultimate priority. So do your best to share these kinds of things, whenever you have the chance to, but never at the sake of your own safety. So just to kind of tie things up, that's kind of the model that seems to make sense or has worked very well in situations for us. We're wondering if there's any other kind of methods or tactics that you all have tried or think that might work well in terms of how to approach some of these conversations that might get a little bit more confrontational. If there are any.
Well, I mean, humor is always good. I think it would depend on the situation, but and that goes back to what Dana was saying. If you can, bring in something that just will lighten the mood. I mean, I think it depends on how charged the situation is, but that's certainly something. Or speaking to something from your own experience. I've been in your position before. I've let my dog run off leash. And then I decided, for these reasons, so, maybe some sort of bond in that way with them or bridge.
Definitely. I think that's a great example of that kind of validation piece, recognizing that, it can be inconvenient or frustrating or annoying, whatever, but it really is for the ultimate protection of the park or for each other or for your pet, whatever it might be.
One of the things that I've started to do, because I don't normally receive every complaint that comes to the park. In fact, dogs off leash issues were handled by someone else until fairly recently. And so I'm starting to capture some of the feedback that we're getting from visitors when they write into the park, when they're really frustrated about something. And more often than not, it's dogs off leash of the recreate responsibly behaviors that comes up most frequently. It's not like we get a lot of engagement from the visitors via email about it, for example, but occasionally we also do get phone calls. And so I've started to track some comments from people because I feel like those comments are going to be really helpful in all of us helping to tell that story. sans name, without the person's name, but being able to share like, wow, this is really how someone feels. Like, people have said they don't feel like they can come to the park anymore because so many dogs are running off of a leash, that they don't feel that it's safe. Things like that. I think that it's important for us to be able to convey that to people who really, may not look at the world in the same way. Having that conversation, like you said, Susan, that talks about that personal story that someone had about how their mind was changed because of an interaction with a staff person. That same person could have been a volunteer as well. So there are definitely ways to continue to carry those messages forward. And we are finding all kinds of unique ways of trying to do that, but there's more to be done.
My husband just could hear the conversation, and he said, maybe you should hand out like a one-page flyer that has like animal tracks on it. And so just say, these are the animals that your dog could be chasing, and harming, or, something. These are the invasive weeds that your dogs could be. So you're sort of protected in a way then, or there's a cushion between you with education.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great idea. I've just written that down as well. I know one of the things that owners will often say is that my dog would never run away. My dog would never chase another animal. And that's the only thing I wonder about. But I think that would work for some people potentially. Yeah, definitely for some people. I definitely wrote it down. Thank you. That's a great idea.
I'll pass it on to him.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this campaign will continue. We have kind of implemented it through primarily the signs that are out in the park, and also through like social media and some of our communications. I think we are looking, especially as we're getting into a new year and a new season, looking for additional ways to be able to educate folks around some of these principles. So I think being able to develop resources like that maybe volunteers can have on hand to be able to pass out, it's a really great idea. Something we can consider internally to be able to provide for folks. Kind of on that comment too, about, these are the animals that you might be harming by having your dog off leash. I do think being able to tie it back to some of those kinds of specific things that people get excited about in our parks, as a part of kind of the built-in environments. I think being able to tie back, that dog behavior or any of these behaviors back to those specific, really cherished kinds of things as a nice way to be able to kind of bridge that understanding, like you were saying. In one of the previous conversations that we had in one of these trainings, somebody mentioned that this is the time of year that owls are beginning to nest, and that dogs off leash can really scare owls and disrupt some of those nesting areas, things like that. And I know that there's several Twitter accounts, I think, dedicated to the many different owls and hawks and all sorts of things that are within Rock Creek Park. I know it's something that is really cherished by this community, and it's great to be able to see that diversity of wildlife in the area. But keeping dogs off of leash really can threaten kind of the continuation of those activities and us being able to be witness to those things. I think another example kind of in the spring for that is the spring ephemerals that come up, the really nice springtime wildflowers that are always really gorgeous and really colorful and just really exciting after being indoors all winter. So I think being able to tie back to things like that, dogs often obviously go off trail, can really trample a lot of those species, can again contribute to the invasive spread that kills off a lot of those species. So I think you're right, being able to tie it back to those kinds of specific things that have maybe kind of an emotional tug on what people are interested in, I think can be a really effective way to spread that message.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's so much nature we can see, and yet there's so much nature that is kind of hidden behind the scenes, just in the fact that we are a park and, where animals are located and some of the areas and times that they might come out when we're not here. I agree. I think there are even more stories to be told.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that I don't have anything intelligent to add in terms of methods or anything, but I think that, Dana, when you mentioned that there are more rangers that are just roving, I'm so excited to hear that. And I know that you are too, because I think that having, if you're a visitor and your first interaction with someone tied to the park, whether it's a ranger or a volunteer who has a position of authority, is you're doing something wrong. You know what I mean? That kind of like regulatory, enforcement kind of perspective. I mean, regardless of whether or not, yes, you did do something like, you are doing something wrong, your pet is off leash, whatever. It's, once people know the importance of the resource and the importance of the park, it's like the cliche that they'd want to protect it more. So, having that kind of, I guess for me, like when I've been out in the park before, and kind of coming from it from that perspective of like, do folks really know, why this park is so important? And so
Yeah,
you
I
kind of
agree.
open that conversation with the positive, like you're saying, which is why, even interacting with visitors just in general, you build that rapport with people so that when they see you coming down the trail, they're not going to go, oh, great.
Right.
Which is unfortunate because, staffing has been so tight at so many sites. That's pretty much all that rangers can do is the enforcement aspect,
And the way I look at it in our end, none of what we as interpreters, what we call interpreters in the National Park Service is, if you think about it this way, rangers are like teachers in the forest or of historic sites. And what we try to do is to help translate nature and history into something the public can understand. When we engage with visitors, I mean, sometimes the uniform itself might be scary for some folks. Sometimes people don't want to see someone in a uniform coming at them. So it's really important for us to be really friendly and really polite and respectful and all of those things. And that's why I really like to give people the benefit of the doubt. Hey, after you warm them up, after you have the conversation, after you share a joke, hey, a lot of people don't realize that. And then help them understand and bridge it in there, because people are more willing to listen to what you have to say. And they're going to have a better experience now with someone in a ranger uniform, or in a volunteer uniform, or in a Rock Creek Conservancy uniform. They're going to have a much better experience. And their time in the park is not necessarily then tainted with, oh, well, I should just leave now, or I had a really horrible experience. Yeah, totally agree.
Yeah.
Any other last thoughts on de-escalation, communicating these messages? Anything else? That's okay. Thank you all so much for sharing. I think it's been a really rich conversation, and there's been a lot of really good ideas on kind of how to approach this. There's never kind of a one size fits all approach. I think all of these conversations will look slightly different. So really, this is just about kind of equipping you with the skills and background knowledge, and just kind of the general stewardship education, so that you can speak confidently and authoritatively when you are interacting with park visitors.
Yeah, the way I like to look at it is that we're all ambassadors, right? We're ambassadors to help protect Rock Creek Park, no matter who you're engaging with.
It's up to all of us.
So, well, thanks, you guys. I want to say thank you for joining us today. We certainly are happy to chat with you further. If you have any further questions, both Elaine and I will be on the line for the next few minutes.